Oh, these are quite nice. These are plates that were made during the National Union from the mining communities as part of commemoration of the Great Strike in 1984 and 5. This is a protest that took place to mark the 20th anniversary of the Paris Commune, and one of the speakers here was Eleanor Marx. And in fact, around the pub, apparently, there's a pub around the corner called the Three Kings, and after the Commune was crushed in 1871, several of the communards used to meet, exiled communards used to meet in the pub, in the room above the pub, and I like to go there and think about that. And you'll probably understand these better than I do, but they're part of a fantastic collection we have of Soviet posters. This was a commemorative banner. It's presented to the veterans of the international brigades after they'd left Spain to thank them from the people of Barcelona. Yes, I wish I could show you Lenin's room, but unfortunately that's all shut up at the moment. This fantastic mural was painted by a man called Jack Hastings, who's actually an aristocrat, the Earl of Huntingdon, I think. There's a huge collection of that was donated by a communist intellectual called James Klugman that we hold here, of labour movement pamphlets and books that he collected. A lot of them are here, but then there are a lot of other things that were donated. There's a lot of biographies of working class figures from Britain. There's a lot of work on the Soviet Union.
Have anything new from Russia?
No, but we would like some. If we do, I don't know about it, but we would definitely like some. Yeah.
You have some Russians in your groups?
Yes, we have some. We've had a couple of Russians. I had a Russian in our last class, which looked at the state and what the relationship between governments, states and big business. And I think her perspective was absolutely fascinating for people in Britain. My name is Jonathan White. I teach at the Marx Memorial Library, which is the building we're in now, in central London. It's a historic building which was set up in 1933 during the as a decision was made when the Nazi book burning began in 1933 that it was vital that the British trade union movement had a building and a resource, that the working class movement had a resource to teach them about Marxism and the history of the working class struggle, and that's where we are today. Marx Memorial Library has recently reopened its workers' school. We're working very closely with a number of organisations in the trade union movement now, and the popularity of the classes that we teach here in the library is growing every year. Readers are growing. The library is a small institution run by volunteers, but the number of readers we have is growing all the time. The number of people we have coming in for lectures in the evening has grown markedly in the last few years. In fact, one of the most remarkable things about it's a way, in a sense, it's a kind of index of the change in British society in the last, I suppose, last 7 or 8 years, is that since we started running classes on Marxism, the last few years they've exploded in popularity. We recently had a lecture series on reading Das Kapital, which is, not the easiest entry point to Marxist thought. It was packed out, and we had queues around the block. Something is happening within British politics, and it's being reflected to a degree in places like this. It's clearly part of a kind of, I suppose, an explosion of discontent within Britain, and which has been ramified across, which has ramified more widely across the globe since the 2008-9 crash. That's really when it started, because I think that exploded a lot of the confidence and a lot that some of the assumptions that people carried around with them about where history was going, how economies worked. A lot of that confidence was hugely dented in the 2008-9 crash, and in the global recession that followed, you had conservative government in Britain imposing very deep cuts through austerity policies that hurt working people terribly badly, but which also damaged a lot of people who considered themselves to be middle class, I suppose. A lot of them felt that their livelihoods were suddenly, their assumptions that life was going to progressively continue getting better and that their children were going to have the same, if not better, lifestyle than they had had. A lot of that confidence disappeared as well. So there was a lot of anger around among younger people, and in particular that needed explaining. And I think by any index, people, with every capitalist crisis, Marx is rediscovered. We always say this in the library, every generation rediscovers Marx, because every generation at one point in their life will have some form of capitalist crisis break out in their society. But that's certainly happened this time. There's been a kind of ferment of thinking on the left, some of it quite eclectic, some of it sort of radical liberal, I suppose, but a very important resurgence of interest in Marxism, and we've seen that reflected in the library, definitely. I go back to in the late 1990s and early 2000s, social democratic governments were saying that they had solved the issues of boom and bust economics, and when 2008 to 9, when the financial crash happened, and it became clear just how fragile the global economy was, because we had a global financial crisis and a global economic depression on the back of that crash. Then I think, as I say, a lot of people had their confidence about the way that life was going damaged. But there was very material hardships were imposed on people, and I think for some sections of the British working class, life only got marginally worse, and there were people who had lost out through the years of neoliberalism, people whose industries have been destroyed, whose regions have been economically devastated, and for those people, the kind of public spending cuts that came with austerity governments just turned the screw even more on them. It just added to their anger, simmering anger. But what was significant, I think, was that sections of the British middle class suddenly had spending cuts imposed on them that meant that university became an expensive thing, that people would saddle themselves with significant debts to go to, that schools started to have become short of money, that hospitals have become desperately short of money, that the National Health Service has deteriorated. And we look at the really incredibly sluggish growth in the British economy, and we know that we've got a massive problem. We know that if there is another financial crash, that this country in particular, this country almost more than most other countries, is peculiarly dependent on finance capital. The City of London is a hugely important economic player in Britain, and Britain's industrial base has been absolutely devastated over the last 30 years. And nothing has changed that. No government has broken with that model, which means that Britain's economy is characterised by low-skilled employment in service industries, retail, hospitality, the food industry. It's very low-skilled employment. For most people, their prospects for large sections of the working class, their prospects of employment and of a career are very, very poor. That their working lives are going to be dominated by precarious work, low wages, high levels of debt, you add the potential for another financial crash, and no one thinks that it's not going to happen. Everybody knows that there is going to be another financial crash. So, in a sense, you know, I think there is a popular basis for the idea that we can do better than this as a society. That people deserve to have a greater level of aspiration in that, and that, I think, that coalition of interest between, I suppose, exploited urban workers, downwardly mobile middle class, traditional middle class, although they are part of the broader working class, and then that post-industrial working class, that's a huge threat for the ruling class in Britain. The huge threat is that mass of people become united around the idea that Britain can be a more prosperous and fairer society which offers people decent standard of living. That's a massive threat for the ruling class. To a degree, it is being repeated here. I mean, in each political environment, the specific features will be different, but there are some general things general trends that I think are common, and not just to Trump, but also to people like Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, exactly. So, and the commonalities, I think, are that you have large numbers of people who have, during the periods of neoliberalism, when neoliberalism was, I suppose, hegemonic and unquestioned, and after the retreat of socialist states and mass socialist parties, you had, I suppose, there was a hollowing out of democratic institutions and of mass participatory bodies. So economically, large sections of working classes in former industrial countries lost their industries, and underwent a process of class decomposition. So they were no longer being organized, in the Marxist sense. Industry was no longer organizing those people in the workplace. Marx talks about, capital itself organizes workers. And that's ceased to happen for significant sections of Britain's working class, the Rust Belt in the United States and elsewhere. So that's a feature of it, that deindustrialization plays a process in disorganizing people. Political parties became concentrated around a very narrow spectrum. They became technocratic in their approach to the economy. It was just, there were very small political differences, but all of them assumed that their job was to manage a fundamentally market economy slightly better than the other party. And so political participation eroded in large areas of those societies. Now what happens is, we've had, as I was just talking about, I think an explosion of discontent with the system, but that discontent has flown off in different forms. Yeah, and that 30s. Yeah, exactly.
It's the totally opposite.
Absolutely.
Outcome.
And when you have people who are alienated from political processes, and someone who has the backing of the mass media, or at least enjoys a large amount of exposure from the mass media, and who is acceptable to the big monopolies and finance capitalists, in the last instance as preferable to a radical socialist party, for example, you get the emergence of these kind of authoritarian political figures who promise to cut through all the bullshit. This is the promise that Modi made. All this we'll cut through this technocratic bullshit and we'll just get stuff done. Trump does exactly the same thing. He promises to cut through just by force of will and delivering on the popular mandate. We'll just get things done, and you won't have to be bamboozled by these technocratic political establishment, and they're able to paint themselves to a degree as being anti-establishment. And that there is an element of that in the election of Boris Johnson, I think, quite definitely. What's happened there is that the Conservative Party in Britain, which has traditionally represented an alliance of big capital, industrialists and the petty bourgeoisie. That coalition was breaking down, and they were struggling to hold their electoral coalition together. The issue of exiting the European Union became a hugely divisive issue, but it was one that Boris Johnson was able to use as a kind of battering ram for his politics of getting things done. And so I think these strongman, authoritarian right-wing figures who promise to just get stuff done, they are able to appeal to people who are completely disconnected from political processes and have no trust for politicians, and see even their local MP who might be politically left-wing, might be radical, see them as part of a political establishment which has failed them. And ultimately, if there are no organizations in those communities which give people an alternative worldview, and all they are hearing from the media is, this man will get things done, it's not surprising that they can swing enough votes to rebuild an electoral coalition again. No, I don't actually. No,
Everywhere.
Yeah, it's not a global catastrophe. I think the potential for serious global catastrophe is huge. There's no doubt about it. And you mentioned the 1930s again, and there are, I think, strong parallels. I mean, all history is different, but there are dynamics at work that were at work in that period also. I don't see it as a catastrophe for the left because it's a cliche to say that we learn. The left, how the working class movement learns from its defeats, and this setback, as with other setbacks, is teaching important lessons to the left. I mean, one of the interesting things I was reading the other day about an analysis of, and this is, I suppose, an example of what I'm talking about, of the Corbyn phenomenon. The explosion of radical, popular aspiration for a better world that became expressed in a radical, social democratic, almost socialist program. Which, don't forget, 10 million plus people voted for that. And it scared the bejesus out of the ruling class. It scared them rigid. But one of the things it's taught them is that they need to pay attention to organisation, to deep organisation. Corbyn's Labour popularity and the revival of the Labour left is almost unorganised. And in fact, that's been one of its strengths. It's been able to sidestep the blockages of the old social democratic structure of the Labour Party and sidestep some of the problems of its failure of its inability to control individual constituency parties or win control of constituency parties. Well, it's leapt over that because people simply wanted to vote for a leader who they thought that would deliver a more interesting, a more exciting, different kind of politics. But the limits of that are they still don't control the organisation of the Labour Party. Plus, they don't control the votes of a significant section of the working class in those post-industrial districts that have just voted Conservative MPs, often for the first time ever, because the things that the institutions and practices that embedded a level of class consciousness and a level of organisation in those areas, the industries that organise people at the point of production, the associational life that comes with that, the sense of community, the trade unions, the community organisations, those have all broken down. And unless the left and the labour movement can do something to rebuild organisation in those communities, it's going to struggle to deliver electoral majorities. But that lesson has been absolutely demonstrated. The importance of that has been demonstrated. Previously, I think there was a sense on the left that actually people would, if you just gave them a manifesto that was exciting enough, that it would get enough votes, and the job is harder than that. But it is that lesson is an important point, and I think that the danger is, the difference between optimism and catastrophe is, can we learn in the working class movement and on the left, learn those lessons fast enough before genuine catastrophe is brought upon us by the crisis within capitalism and the fact that imperialist conflicts are now being fought out by people who are quite prepared to flirt with fascism, quite prepared to flirt with the far right, and who are quite prepared to engage in, I suppose, racist and xenophobic political repression at home and imperialist wars abroad.
So you think fascism is a relevant word? It is appropriate?
I think absolutely, definitely. It has to be used carefully because it has a specific content. It is, there are fascist organizations, and then there are fascist states, and fascist states have are a particular thing. They're not, they're not the same as a government which has a democratic majority, but that includes fascism. We are not at the stage now yet, but we're not far away from it, where you have fascism, as Dimitrov defined it, as the openly terrorist dictatorship of finance capital. The point where, and that, I suppose, if you were looking for what would that mean now, that would mean the point at which the big corporations and finance capitalists within given states have decided that they are prepared to hand complete political power to fascist parties, to destroy democratic organizations, to destroy internal political opposition, to destroy politics, in essence. And we are not yet at that point. Where we are is significantly on the road towards that, and it is, we know from from history where that will lead. And it is, if a war that killed 36 million people in Europe in the 1940s will be as nothing to the kind of global conflict that could be unleashed today. So yes, we should be very frightened, but it is. I think it's also important to see the possibilities and the potentials of the current moment as well. I think the contradictions between finance capital in particular and multinational capitals and domestic capital have become wider, because what has changed since the 1930s is that the world market has become more financialized, that capital is more mobile, more global, and there is, I think, there is a wider contradiction between the interests of those sections of the capitalist class who are interested in moving money around the globe very fast and only tangentially interested in what happens within the host economies where they happen to be based. There is a wider, and the same goes for many multinationals. There's a wider contradiction between those and the broad mass of smaller capitalists who are embedded within particular national economies. Now, in the 1930s, the argument went, and it was always a staple of Communist Party versions of Marxism, that there was the potential, you had to build united fronts whose class basis was an alliance of the working class, the peasantry, and sections of the capitalist class. Well, the basis for that is bigger, if anything now, than it was in the 1930s.
What do you mean?
I mean, a multinational which happens to be based in Britain and an investment bank with outlets all over the world has absolutely zero interest in what happens within Britain, except that, it has very little interest about what happens to the mass of people in Britain. And it will continue to squeeze its supply chains and squeeze dividends out of people regardless of what the social impact of what's happening is. Now that wasn't true of nationally, that is, and it remains untrue, of large numbers of smaller capitalists who are dependent upon what people in Britain and their spending power, or people in Britain and whether or not they're going to rise up. It doesn't make them less capitalist, no. I think I mean that those sections of the capitalist class which are more dependent upon. There is, this contradiction is a real one. Let's get a concrete example. You have a retail giant in Britain. You could call that a national capital, but actually it's owned entirely by investment banks and asset management funds located anywhere, all over the globe, and its actions squeeze all the companies in its supply chain. Now, all those companies in its supply chain could be based in Europe. Some of them will be a lot of them will be based in Britain. Suppliers in Britain, distribution companies in Britain, and they're all feeling the squeeze from the investment, the financialized company at the top. Now, you can't really, that's not really a national capital in the sense that I'm talking about. I think what I'm talking about is much more a sort of the potential for temporary alliances which are articulated in terms of a kind of national renewal, like national economic and social renewal. Well, I think they're both expressions of the same development, though. I mean, what Trump and Johnson are doing, they are a political understanding that there is a problem, that globalization has caused immense problems within national economies, and that the very stability of the ability of finance capital and multinationals to continue doing their business relies upon some level of concession to those issues, because otherwise they are going to be electorally defeated and face a backlash from far more radical left-wing forces. So they're making a nod to, they're making a gesture towards this kind of rhetoric of national renewal. Now, is Trump actually creating any kind of sustainable national renewal that is felt by the mass of people in the United States? I don't think so. I don't think Johnson will succeed either. But the political phenomenon of this is happening is significant. The radical potential is that the masses of people can be brought into alliance with some sections of the capitalist class around agenda which is about providing decent jobs, providing productive industries, rebuilding productive industries. Britain's working class works in low-skilled retail, service industries dominated by precarious work. If Britain were to try to pay its way in the global economy through trade, it wouldn't be able to do it. Now, that's not a socialist project, but socialists and the working class are the only forces that can lead that alliance and then develop in the process, isolate monopoly and finance capital politically, and build their own forces in the process, build their own class cohesion in the process, and develop the struggle that way. Marx is relevant for as long as capitalism exists, because he provides Marxism and the body of thought that has developed since the middle of the 19th century, provides the only explanation for what is happening. There's a reason it keeps coming back. It's the only body of thought that explains that capitalism is capable of understanding that capitalism didn't always exist. It does exist now, and that there are processes at work within it that are laying the foundations of the potential for a better, higher social order, for a better form of society than the current one. Plenty of people before Marx and since developed criticisms of capitalism's moral effects. It's economic unfairness, it's the injustice. What Marx did that is thoroughly, and what Marxism does, which is thoroughly revolutionary, is to give you a science for understand that helps you to understand how capitalism came into being, what are the forces that structure it, what are the forces at work within it, and how are they pointing the way to the future, and furthermore, how understanding those processes allows you to play an active role, and us in history to play an active role in developing those forces. When we run these classes and we talk about history, the reason we put on classes around, lots of people want to come and talk about capitalism, but the really important thing that Marxism gives you is a whole world view for understanding the sweep of human history and the interconnection of all phenomena, and an understanding of your place within history, I think, and the role of the way that your political praxis can become part of changing reality. And that's what we always say to people, that it's the richness of that whole body of thought that needs to be understood. You asked about classes and whether they still exist. Most definitely. I mean, if you think about the Marxist definition of working classes, in essence, when you boil it down, are people compelled to go and sell their labour to a class of people who control the means of production every day? Yes, overwhelmingly. In fact, more people than ever before in the history of capitalism are now compelled to do that every day. There's the working class globally is bigger than it's ever been. So yes, there's no doubt that classes still exist. However, the thing that I think divides people and prevents them from seeing that and leads to all kinds of political, it's the basis of social democracy and the basis of all kinds of other political, phenomenon, that liberalism and things that cloud an understanding, a wider understanding of that, is that the working class is also intensely stratified globally. There is a massive global market now within which and a global division of labour, and if you look at one country, you will find that the working class is incredibly stratified, and that there is a cultural gulf between the life experiences of some sections of a working class and others, and yet all of them exist on the edge of economic oblivion, unless they go to work and sell their labour in the market to people who control the means of production every day. The difficulty, the task for for labour movements, for working class movements, is how do you build unity between people, sections of a working class whose life experiences are so different, and also internationally between people who don't understand that a lot of their standard of living is dependent upon their country's exploitation of another country and the movement of surplus value around the world. I wouldn't entirely agree that that's what he said at times, but he did also look at the potentials and became quite interested in the potentials for revolution breaking out in Russia, for example, which was by no means the most advanced capitalist state in Marx's lifetime. There's an issue of the levels of his thought there. So at the most abstract level, looking at capitalism as a total mode of production, he said the capitalism needed to be developed. There needed to be a development of the productive forces of capitalism and the relations of production of capitalism globally to a significant enough point that where there was a break in the chain, then other working classes could push that revolution forward. My understanding of it is that and I think this is, Lenin developed this significantly, was that the weak links of capitalism were where outbreaks would happen first, but that unless you had a level of development of capitalist relations of production and of working class organisation on that basis, that the basis for a social revolution that would unlock a higher social order was not there. You've asked me a really difficult question, which I think in Britain we are only just beginning to think about addressing again, the importance of addressing again. I talked about there being an explosion of interest in Marxism, and I think there has been, you know, within young people in particular, but the level of understanding of the Soviet Union, of even the most basic understanding of the Soviet Union, and of why people might have argued that it was socialist is very, very low. I do think that is addressing that educational issue, I suppose, is I think a vital part of political education, the political education that's necessary, and it requires proper use of Marxist analysis, and it requires nuance, and those things are very difficult in when you have had generations of people who have been educated with a fundamentally liberal outlook on the world, which views the absence of representative democracy and the use of political repression and executions as being, that's how you judge a society. Not, well, you judge a society by, if you're a Marxist, you start from its relations of production and its ability to develop productive forces.
Was it a socialist?
I think undoubtedly it was a post-capitalist society. It was laying, there were socialist relations of production within the Soviet Union, definitely, and it was attempting to lay the basis of a wider socialist mode of production. And I think significant socialist institutions were created in the Soviet Union. We don't know enough about it. You know, it's something I want to learn more about myself, and I'm determined to do it. Was it destined to collapse is a very difficult question. I think if you were beginning to look for an answer for why it collapsed, you'd have to look at how well established socialist relations of production actually were. There was some very good work by an academic in Cambridge. Not many academics are even remotely sympathetic to the Soviet Union, but some few are, and have done some very interesting work looking at the ways in which inequality, which of course Marx said would exist for an epoch of social revolution. There was never going to be total equality, and the process, you know, when you go back to Marx in the critique of the Gotha program and look at what he was talking, you know, the description of, you know, in his formulations where he's just imagining a future world, a future epoch of social revolution, it's quite clear that he means something that's going to last decades, if not centuries, you know, a process that's going to last for a very long time. Well, the Soviet Union lasted 70 years and needed to, and attempted to do a lot, and had to do a lot very, very quickly. You would have to look at things like the growth of inequality, the build-up of resentments around certain sections of working class who became perhaps more petty bourgeois in their outlook and looked out to Western countries for what they thought was a fairer reward for their skills and their knowledge and their understanding. And then you'd have to look at, well, why wasn't there, the question you have to ask, I suppose, is why wasn't there more resistance to the fall of the Soviet Union? Why wasn't there a more popular uprising? Although, you know, it is always worth remembering that the referendum result, which said that no one actually really wanted to overthrow the Soviet Union, but perhaps they just weren't willing to defend it against people who were determined to put it to an end. And you'd have to look at why it was not possible to reform it. And these are, but then, you know, I don't have any answers for that at all, actually. But I think they are of the utmost relevance for everyone who calls himself a Marxist, and for the entire working class movement, because it's a huge part of our history. It's a huge source of experience for the working class movement to draw on, good and bad, you know, things to learn from. But the problem we have in Western countries is the almost inability to begin that conversation. What happens is that debate is very quickly closed down with immediate references to Stalin, to concepts of totalitarianism, the bandying around of vast numbers of dead, which have been calculated in millions, millions and millions of dead, who are all attributed to the political regime, even though they refer to famine deaths and even the absence of births in many cases. But I mean, the conversation is entirely dominated by liberal prejudices, and it's very difficult to move people beyond that. That said, again, one of the interesting things about the resurgence of interest in Marxism, and you see this reflected in the Labour Party to a degree, is there are young people now who are willing to look at that more carefully and more, in Britain, there are people younger people within the Labour Party now who are not willing to accept that simple explanation and are looking with more interest at that history and wanting to understand it better. So I think there are opportunities to do it. And to repeat myself again at the cost of being boring, I think risk of being boring is it really is, to me, it's a vital part of the history of the global working class, and it has to be understood in all of its facets. What I'm interested in is what are the potentials for rebuilding a working class politics within Russia, and rebuilding, I suppose, communist parties in Russia, rebuilding a communist party which could mount a challenge to Russian state power again, because Russia is a hugely significant country within the global economy now. The imperialist drive towards war is pointed in several directions at once. The US imperialism is focused on China, but it's also focused on Russia. And EU imperialism is very focused on Russia, and there is an alliance of interests between the United States and the EU to an extent in weakening Russia geopolitically, whatever its political complexion, in weakening Russia, and in extending its own sphere of influence, breaking it up, preventing any kind of challenge to the expansion of European and US multinationals and finance capital. Russia's current government presents something of a fetter upon that expansion. Whatever its political complexion, whatever its the character of Russian capitalism, it does those kind of. We are at a point where those inter-imperialist rivalries are becoming focused on China and Russia, and that's very, very dangerous. Well, there is a third international still. I mean, the international communist parties are still active, and they are still, and in some countries they are still quite powerful. And, depending on your understanding of what's happening in China, there's no doubt that represents a serious thorn in the side of US imperialism in particular. And it represents an alternative pole for many states. I think Lenin's approach to it would be that you examine and understand the concrete situation in every circumstance, and that your duty as a Marxist and within your own working class movement is to settle accounts with your own bourgeoisie, and that is the task. But clearly, the history of the middle of the 20th century shows that in certain circumstances, alliances, particular positions will change. And it's very hard. We don't know what that brawl is going to look like. And I hope it doesn't happen, because it's a terrifying prospect. But yeah, we need to keep analysing the concrete situation in every state to understand what our attitude towards that should be. You're absolutely right to say, though, that we are far weaker. International Marxist movements and working class movements are organisationally far weaker than they were. That is without doubt. I am certainly not going to speculate about quantum mechanics and take a view about quantum mechanics and its conformity or otherwise with materialist dialectics. My view as a student of dialectics and not and of history primarily is that and so what I will say is some of the greatest scientists of the 20th century were operating, if not actually as dialectical materialists, then very near to being dialectical materialists, and found it an extremely useful way of thinking. And some of their insights then were just as open to a technological or positivist understanding of the world, and yet they found dialectical materialism hugely important and productive for them. And I think I don't think it will ever cease. What dialectical materialism does is, I think, is help you to understand how knowledge and material reality advance together, and how understandings that you think are that people think are part of purely intellectual processes are in fact rooted in the attempts to solve the practical material questions of the day. I don't think that's changed at all. People are always and we find this at the library. People are always terrified when you start saying dialectical materialism at them. It's it's like the kind of, this is almost like seen to be kind of degree level Marxism. Once you're going to go and understand capitalism, and you understand class struggle, and then you understand party, and you might understand historical materialism, and then someone says dialectical materialism, and then everyone gets depressed. It's such an important part of Marxist science, and it's actually such an everyday way of thinking. There's actually, it's quite common to talk about the extent to which people's thought is governed by reification or liberal, or the hegemony of liberal ideas. But dialectical materialism is the idea that things consist of processes which are constantly interacting with each other, and that human action changes conditions and then becomes sedimented in conditions which then shape the possibilities of future human action. And those are actually very, very common sense ideas, and they're right at the core of Marxism. They're at the core of understanding that nothing ever stands still, and that history is always moving, and things are always in a process of coming into being and passing out of being. And that's why he calls it a profoundly heretical and revolutionary form of thought, because it's the only form of thought that tells you that what you now assume as being the world around you is in a process of changing. That's very interesting, and I wasn't aware of that. I mean, the difference I think here is that was effectively the governing ideology, of the ideology of the governing parties in Britain and the USA throughout the 80s, and certainly certainly throughout the 80s, and to an extent now. One of the problems that the British left has, and I think it's very apparent to a lot of people now, is that there is a form of that, a form of radical liberalism, which on the surface of it, it's very radical sounding and full of sort of Marxism jargon and emancipatory language, but is in fact highly conformist and liberal in its implications for the world and in its practical outcomes. And you see it expressed in a kind of identity politics, which is very hugely influential, I suppose, among young people on campuses, in particular. It's strong within universities, and it comes out of what happened to liberation movements in the 60s and 70s. Liberation movements around feminism and anti-racism. And I'm caricaturing quite crudely here, but anti-racism, feminism, and lesbian and gay emancipatory politics was envisaged by people on the left as part of a broadly anti-capitalist project in which they were seen to be oppressions that were rooted in capitalism's exploitative relationships, and just but how that exploitative relationship then intersected with specific other oppressions and reinforced them. Over the course of the 1980s and 90s, as the socialist project sort of went into retreat, those liberation strands developed a kind of radical liberal form of identity politics, which has almost exactly the opposite outcome. Rather than striving for unity, you assert your right not to be offended, your right to be recognised as oppressed, your right to speak about your oppression without anyone telling you you're part of another struggle, the authenticity of your own voice. And it's very weird that the concept of ideology has disappeared here. You know, in traditional emancipatory politics, we would, or working class politics, we would talk about about experience, alienation, the influence of ideology, and how you build solidarity and how you build unity. And this is a politics which is left-sounding but is profoundly reactionary in many ways, because it's about people who say that they understand entirely what is happening to them and their status in the world, and that their oppression is entirely visible to them, and that their voice just needs to be accepted in the world. We aim to provide classes for people at all levels, and the point of the workers' school is that anyone can come along to them, and it's always been like that. But we also try to develop courses for trade unionists specifically that are rooted, that introduce them to Marxism through problems that they experience in the workplace, and show them how Marxism provides answers for that. We provide, throughout each year we have a full program of lectures and classes at different levels. So you will have, prominent Marxist academics or theorists or labour movement people will come and give a lecture, and then at the same time there'll be a series of classes going on around a specific theme of Marxism. And we try to provide it at all levels, so that we run introductory levels, courses where no one is expected to know anything about Marxism, but then we also provide more developed courses which look at in more detailed issues like imperialism and capitalist crisis, and then we try and produce those online as well. So routine here is that every evening there is something happening. We try to work with, there's the Working Class Movement Library, which is in Manchester, Salford rather. We have a close relationship with them, and we're trying to make sure that we run an Engels lecture in tandem with them. every year. Engels' relationship with Manchester is very strong, so they run courses up there, lectures up there as well. So we are trying to develop our links here. We're trying to build build links with institutions in other cities as well, that mean that we can start this kind of education here. But I suppose the most important thing that I think needs to happen now is to build links with the closer links with the trade union movement and with the Labour Party. There are so many young people now involved in not just young people either, it's people of all ages, but a lot of young people involved in the Labour Party who really want to know about Marxism more, and they want to understand more about the world, and we have to provide things for that. 2017, for the anniversary of the centenary of the October Revolution, we were able to run a conference together with the Society for Cooperation in Russian and Soviet Studies, which was huge, absolutely huge. We ran it in Congress House, which is the conference center of the Trade Union Congress, and it was full, absolutely full. And it was the biggest discussion I think there has been around about the significance, the world significance of the October Revolution that there's been in Britain for many, many years. So I think that one of our jobs now is to develop our work, not just around Marxism, but in understanding the history of actually existing socialism and the significance of those states, not just the Soviet Union, but all of those states as well, and to understand what's happening currently in China, because what's happening in China could be one of the most significant global developments taking place right now.
You have your personal answer to this?
No, I have a personal question about it, which is that I need to study it more. But what interests me is understanding the relations of production in China more. What is the balance of socialist and capitalist relations of production in China, and how does the political character of that regime manage those forces, and how is the struggle between socialism and capitalism in China then reflected in the Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, and where that's going? We have to understand that, because it's of the utmost global significance, I think. When we talk about the revolution, we're talking about a thing that's happening all the time, and it goes forwards and it goes backwards, and it takes political form, and then those political forms are overthrown. I think, Lenin talked about was it Lukács talking about Lenin? I can't remember, but talked about the distinguishing character of the period that started in 1917 was that the socialist revolution became an actual thing, because socialist relations of production, and because the development of capitalist economic relations and the development of socialist challenges and of working class movements reached a certain point where outbreaks were always going to take place, and the question was, would any regime, would any political forces be able to develop those socialist economic relations and unlock the potential within humanity to a significant degree? I think my personal view is we saw a huge advance in that process during the 20th century in the Soviet Union, which reshaped the capitalist world around it as well. Don't forget that the capitalism made strategic concessions to the working class across Europe, precisely because of the existence of a different mode of different socialist relations of production in the Soviet Union, and of the strength of communist parties at that time within Western Europe. And that was, it reshaped the entire capitalist world, and it reshaped the system of empires and colonies that existed at that time. Now, that has been rolled back. China still exists. Those relations, the global working class still exists. Huge concentrations of workers exist in the developing world, being thrown together by capitalist production, organised at the point of production. The question is, can those forces be given political expression? The question isn't whether the socialist revolution will happen. It is happening, but will it happen fast enough to prevent us from a far, far worse history?